All right, guys. So I think it goes without saying that the time is now. I recently spoke to a room full of CIOs in Mexico, and that was the one thing that I can say across the board that everybody was doing was something now. And so the concept is very much not just a concept that's a theory. It's being used in practical application across many Fortune 500s, small business, that you would never think would be involved in emerging technology. Johnny's got some fabulous stories about that as well. And the advent of AI, I think, is really going to democratize organizations. It's really going to take out competition quicker. And the ripe ideas, I think, are the ones that are going to come to life as far as organizations go. So leading with innovation, the time to start is now. So I always like to start off with a little bit of what some of the analysts say, not necessarily that, the word is gold, but I think it's important to kind of note where folks are. So exploration mode is something we used to talk about. I think you've probably heard the terms pilots, right? And proof of value, proof of concepts. I think everybody's come up with their own iteration of it. But what's so interesting is that that's a staggering statistic of folks that are in exploration mode of something that we just heard the new name for it last year. And then 19% are already in production phase. So if you look at some of the technologies that are predecessors to this emerging technology, this is far superseding anything that we've seen in the past as far as adoption goes. And that's really tremendous when you think about it, because this is the first time that we're really seeing C-suite come together from top down and bottom up and say, this must be a corporate initiative. I think all of us can relate to the tipping point for generative AI being about data. So, we've been talking about data lakes, what we're doing with our data, how do we get to our data, how do we access our data with some of the technologies that came in advance, right? And several of you had noted that you were RPA practitioners or users in the past. And I think every RPA organization or any organization that's using it, we're seeing more and more of a trend to say, how do we reallocate that budget for AI initiatives? And there's not that much of a difference if you get the teams right on board. And so that's some of the stuff that Johnny and I will be talking about, the different areas that are not only budgeting for this, but really thinking through, how do I become a strategic partner in this data world and then leverage the power of AI to access my data internally. There's use cases where you don't even have to border the brinks of these concerns about large language models and open source. There's areas where AI can be used internally on your data, and we're going to talk about that today as well. The tipping point does have everything to do with data, but it's not everything to do with data. And as we're getting kind of to this glowing mark that they delineate here, we're finally at the point where the machines have learned. That's what's happened. It's not machine learning, right? They're still learning, but the machines have learned, and thus creating this this category, this concept of intelligent automation. It's not just automation, it's intelligent now. So we have Shell, an author, on as well today, who has contributed this piece. It's a sneak peek of one of the compositions that she has in a book that's coming out later today. But I love the way that she kind of laid this out for us, right? And this is the kind of the Maslow's hierarchy, but of AI. And if you start from the bottom up, the basic AI functionality is some of what many of you are familiar with, right? Is really getting to the point where the machine does and acts on a behavior enough times to where it then learns, right? And then later from learning, it can then prescribe. Well, because you did this last time 600 times, it's likely that your next decision is X, right? And so that's that basic learning that we begin to start with. The security and reliability have been concerns that have come up in several organizations and have made a splash in the news over the course of the last year as well. With every single time a technology kind of takes off, there's always going to be a risk associated with its implementation and or exploration. So the AI security and reliability, more organizations have had to come up with a governance, more of a concept. There's a lot of committees that are happening. We have an $18 billion manufacturing organization. They have an AI committee. So every shared service has a member of the team that's part of this AI committee to make sure that the reliability and the security concerns that these AI departments are coming up with are actually going to adhere to what the SLAs are in the business. So you're seeing a lot more of that. The integration and acceptance, and that's really what we're here to kind of garner today. That your competition is doing this day in and day out. If they're not considering it, remember that staggering statistic, 19% have it in production already. You want to be part of at least the 70% that's ready to think through what they're going to do by the end of this calendar year. When we look at optimization and then recognition, that's where the human intervention starts coming into play here. And this is where you get to kind of the next level, right? Where you begin to have inputs that are going to fortify the decisions that your machines are making for you, thus making you not only an intelligent automation group, but an intelligently automated organization, right? And AI really gets you there faster, and you ultimately get to that strategic impact. So a lot of organizations and leaders are saying, do this AI thing, do this AI thing. Okay, but what is the total cost of ownership of that? What is it going to actually cost me? And what kind of results am I going to see? That strategic impact is ultimately what comes from laying the groundwork on the rest of this. So some of the practical places where AI can help, and this came from a lot of questions asked, in the kind of chatter with these different user groups. And it's really interesting to see all the different areas that you can kind of explore in AI. And if you really think about it from its most basic fundamental concept here, right? It's artificial intelligence, right? So basic concept means that what we've done is create a mechanism for the machine to begin being smart for you, helping create some of those decisions so that you don't have to, right? It's kind of like the same old adage that they used to say about RPA, right? Take the people out of the task so that machines and robots can do the work for you, freeing up your mind. Well, this is a little bit more of an existential version of that, right? This isn't about going through those paces. Those are saying, how can we explode your mind to new ideas on how to operationalize your data? Because you now have access to your data and how your operations work in a way you never had before, right? At an instant, you can read a contract. At an instant, you can find out what the commercial terms are on an SLA for a client. At an instant, you can see if a vendor has some sort of issue, right, that you maybe can't contract with somebody else. At an instant, you can see if a client doesn't have a conflict of interest somewhere else, right? Only by chatting with your data. So some of these areas, if you can kind of take a peek at, what we really want to focus on today is the improving of business operations. That's sort of been the backbone of both Invoke and WonderBotz' story. But there's awesome other use cases, right? We've got a couple of the marketing folks that are going to pilot some of the creative content creation portion of the agenda, right? Getting some of that creative ideas, seeing what it looks like, see, taste, touch. Can we get answers faster? Can we come up with a methodology that works better for writing and, and having some conversions happen as well? Is there a faster way to go about SEO planning, right, for marketers and for folks like that? And then the other one, which Johnny will love, we're piloting right now, is the account plan automation, right? And that's something that, because Paula is going to New York, who has she met with in the past? And AI allows me to get, information not only from my CRM, from my calendar, from what I've done in that city in the past, the restaurants that I've been to, and what my experience should potentially be. So there's practical application all the way through to business operation improvement and everything in between. So what we're hoping to do today as well is kind of give you an idea that this isn't just about chatting ChatGPT to get, the next copy, piece up to date. This isn't just about understanding where AI can be applied to your current operations. This is about completely shaking up the paradigm and breaking the mold, because there's so many areas where this can be applied. So this stat is really interesting as well, and something to kind of take a peek at. And if you look at here, what this is representing is this is the average time of AI use cases going into production. So I'm kind of calling this AI prep. Okay, so with any project of any kind, if you're busy this long, 1 to 3 years, but maybe less than 5 to get ROI, you ain't doing it right. And somebody up top is going to have a problem with that. This is what the average best of breed organizations are doing today, which poses a unique opportunity for folks who are really digging into this to get ahead of the pack, right? And so often when it comes to technology kind of going at lightning speed, which all of these concepts of generative AI and AI have done in the last year, it's really become commercial friendly, everybody kind of knows what it is. You usually run the risk that the big boys are going to be able to do it first, right? And they'll probably price out competition, and capitalism does what capitalism does, right? In this case, though, because there's so many conflicting opinions, and because there have been more .ai startups created in the last 2 years than any other time in history, there's a lot of confusion for the consumer today. So in this confusion, these are kind of the analysis paralysis, as consultants like to call it. If you're stuck here for anywhere under 5 years of trying to get your ROI, you're already losing, right? And so what we've done is take this approach of practical AI. What can we do today that you're going to see benefits of and start getting excited and momentum? And that comes from our history in RPA too, of understanding that you have to have those early wins to gain traction and momentum at an enterprise level. All right. So concerns. I think these are pretty self-explanatory. So it's too difficult. You saw that in the stat prior to, right? It's difficult to get alignment, with different stakeholders, understanding what the value story should be, what the priorities should be. But it's also really difficult to get the budget under control and understand who should own it and who should be the beneficiary. So we've seen a lot of organizations, much like they've done, RPA programs in the past, have things come along from budget requests in finance and accounting. Maybe that's an area of expertise and operation that they want to put into play. But really what's been interesting is us seeing the procurement and contracting organizations. So the business units that have a lot to process and a lot of contracts to check on that have material impact. There's financial concerns with getting something late or having an SLA. Those have been really interesting places. But far too often, these projects take off without really aligning all the stakeholders. And so more than ever, stakeholder alignment has been really, really important, especially since it's about consumption of data that maybe crosses other business units that hasn't traditionally been the past. Hallucinations, false positives, right? What if the machine gets it wrong? Well, that's why we teach it, right? Much like employees, there's a certain level of training that takes place for them to become the expert in their field. Doctors have to go to med school, our AIs must be trained as well. So there is a personification that can be applied here to understand that as we educate, as decisions are made, then the machine will be able to make those predictive and prescriptive decisions down the road. And lastly, security has been a big concern. I think there's a couple of cases up for this in the Supreme Court over the next couple of weeks as well, with the advent of this. And what are the tech giants going to do now with all these additional security measures that they're being used to operationalize advertising, for example, and some of the ways that consumers, interact with what their brands are sharing as well. So these are some of the concerns kind of at a high level that folks are looking at. And these are some of the things that we debunk every day with our client sites. And so wanting to pass along that info to you guys as well. Overall, our recommendation is we say get started, right? And so the education component of this is really kind of a primer for you guys to sort of begin to see that these kind of questions are coming up all over the place. And there's not a silly question in a brand new technology. We really want to make it easy and accessible to get the answers that you need. Then experiment, right? So try a pilot. You can't knock it till you try it. I actually had one of the CIOs, he raised his hand at the end of the talk in Mexico, and he said, but Paula, how do we find out? Such risk-averse audience, right, of CIOs. So Paula, how do I know that we're not going to run into snags? And I said, you won't until you start, right? And I know that that's not the most rewarding of answers when you're thinking through a new technology, but the only way to understand its implication in your organization is to try, right? And so the experimentation, the pilots, there's several offerings on the Invoke and WonderBotz side that I'm excited about Johnny sharing with you guys. But you should be trying it out. Be part of that 70% by the end of this year. Be the ones that are experimenting with this, because otherwise you are behind. And then once you try it out and see some examples of how this works with your data sets and your models, well, then you can actually deploy it, right, within your organization and start getting that momentum and traction. Your board's going to be happy about it. Your shareholders are going to be happy about it, and your boss will too. This is just something that needs to be applied and added to everyday operations and not be thought of as some kind of scary monster coming at you. This is going to be the way the future of work works. And the future of work is now. So last but not least, sharing that we have an AI pilot that's available to everyone that's in our community. I think we have about 30 of you here today out of a group of about 400, that reach out, that ask questions, that participate in a forum, and we'll be giving you guys more information there too. But traditional RPA is kind of a thing of the past. And what we want to do is help you guys understand that it's time to innovate. And as my words always end up being, it's innovate or perish. because your competitors are already doing this. And so the time is now to really add some urgency to your decision making as it relates to AI. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Johnny. I know you have some things in the field that you've come up with along the way. We haven't spoken in a quarter, so I promised everybody here this is like they're getting catch-up time between Paula and Johnny too of what we've learned in the field. I've got some questions that folks have asked in advance of this as well, but I'd love for you to kind of validate, talk through some of the things that the analysts shared and what you're seeing in the field in your prospecting efforts as well.
Oh, my pleasure. It's great to get an overview. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see everybody here. It's interesting. I think I kind of come across when we speak to organizations, I call them the haves and the have-nots, right? You've got these organizations that have big IT organizations and they've got massive investments going. And then you've got organizations that we walk into and they're like, yeah, we haven't really started. We don't really have an organization doing this. Or you have organizations that say, yeah, we've got a whole team doing this, but they're doing this for this one thing. And everybody else is kind of in waiting mode for getting access or getting the ability to do something with respect to AI. And let me take one step back. I think when we speak about AI, obviously there is components of AI, but oftentimes AI is almost a really good message that really doesn't speak to the actual technological side of AI, but more so around, hey, how can technology help me improve my business or improve the work that I do? And that translates into something that may need AI, but sometimes it may just need automation, or it may need a rethink or redesign of the business process altogether. And there's a really good awareness now that given some of these great capabilities that AI has, there could be a way that it could help me as well, right? And so that's how these conversations then start, because many people in organizations now are saying, oh, well, but there must be something that I can do that's smarter, better, faster. And so now that awareness grows into, okay, how can I do this? That's kind of what I'm seeing. You have them, they have nots. And particularly when we look at the conversation that Paula was talking about today, is the biggest advice that we give to our customers and to companies is to, obviously work with your security and legal and everybody else to make sure that you're within the guardrails. But you now can start something and try something very inexpensive and very small, so that you don't feel like you're doing something risky, or that you can at least control the output of it and that you can start learning. So there really isn't a financial or effort barrier in a large degree for you to try something out. And that learning will help you accelerate in terms of, what can the technology do, or some of the pitfalls, and how should I be thinking about these technologies to be able to help me optimize my business. And so that's probably the biggest realization that we've seen in the organizations that we've spoken to, is that many feel like there's still a really big investment needed to get started. Well, that's changed quite a bit. So that's the first part. Let me stop there for a second.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and actually that segues beautifully. One of the questions that was asked is, if this is such an initiative that everybody needs to think through, how do we plan for budgeting, right? And I think I covered that slightly, because there's several different business units kind of competing this. You have the old school shared service people that just by default have always been stuck with the process improvement bill, right? It's the lift and shift and the improvement. And so they tend to have kind of that digital transformation budget, but it's not really a budget. So who owns it, but who has to operate it, right? And then we're seeing a lot of technology folks. So the CIOs are really getting involved and saying, all right, we don't want to go through this whole business user-led situation again, right? Some of them are still having malaise from that. Like, we love that you're getting into technology, finance and accounting. We love that, but we want to have a part in that as we're kind of touching all different APIs and data. So what would you advise to folks? And we have kind of a wide segment here. We've got some finance leaders on, and we've got some COE leaders on. So how would you recommend bridging the gap on, the cost of the LLMs, the talent, getting a partner? How do you think that through, and how have you been explaining that to some of the prospects over the past quarter?
Yeah, I think you take an initial look at what do you have in your organization, right? Because you don't want to duplicate efforts, or you don't want to, start a political war, right? Because everybody will have their feet them up like, hey, that's my responsibility. So you definitely need to take a quick look at that. And then oftentimes when we have that conversation internally, the first question is like, hey, great, we've got some talent, or we've got some technology already that we can leverage, which is fantastic if you can do that. And then the question really becomes, is that something that I can take advantage of? And most of the time the answer is yeah, but in like 6 months or so, right? So you have to have that conversation. Like, do we have something, or can I use it today? And if I can or I can't, now my conversation starts to go, what can I then do today? And oftentimes then you can have the conversation. Maybe I'll start with a partner, or maybe I'll look at a technology that can get me started, where I can do a first few set of use cases. And I'm not necessarily rebuilding everything in my organization, but I'm really starting something that I know I'll get a good return from, but also that I'm not tripping over every learning cycle myself, because that's the biggest thing we've seen is in the typical automation space, in the process redesign space, and now in the AI space, is that the best way that you can go about this is do this with the right technology and the right partner as a starting point. Or even if you want to do it yourself going forward or later, start with something that with people that have done this and technologies that have proven in the market to work, so that you can see what does good look like, and then you can take it internal. So okay, now I know what do I need internally if I want to do it myself, right? Because now you have then a proof point that gives you value, and you can say, hey, it worked, and it's giving value back. So this is something that's real. I can now see, and I've learned that, hey, there's 20 other things that I would like to do, and what the potential value is of that. And you can start putting a business plan together that says, what do I therefore need from a budgeting perspective? Who do I need to hire? What technology do I need to buy? Things like that. So our advice is put a little bit of effort and money aside to be able to do a pilot engagement that teaches you, what do you want in a bigger engagement and as a program in the organization.
No, I think that's spot on. And this kind of like, you're going to love me for saying this, but this kind of reminds me of the ROM architecture from back in the day, where it was, to set something up, you need all these people and all these things and this whole methodology and this whole situation. And I think folks are fatigued from that too, of, did I have to right size my program along the way? What is your advice about right sizing an AI program? As folks are kind of thinking this through, we don't want to we want to learn something from what we did before, right? And not set everything up front. So what's kind of the basic minimum to get you engaged and started on an AI project in an organization?
So I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see is that people look for something to try out as almost a side gig. And the problem with that is when you do something like that, you're not going to give it enough attention, and you won't have enough budget to do it right. I would almost look at the other way and say, what are the 3 things that you're slated to do for the next 12 months? And where do you see potential gaps that won't be able to meet your business objectives? And then take those gaps first and say, how could AI help me do this? How could technology help me solve that problem? And if you do that, you're already spending all your effort of yourself and your team, and the company's already doing this, right? Like, hey, we have to get X new customers, or we have to increase customer experience, or we have to increase revenue, whatever it may be, right? Whatever those key objectives are from the business, and then look for gaps within that area. We've got many companies that are upgrading ERP systems, great, and now that they're upgrading, they've got challenges in operations or whatever it is, great. Can AI help me with that, right? It's already a challenge. If I don't solve for that challenge, I have project delays, I have whatever, like there's big impacts, and it's already a key strategic initiative to get this done. Okay, well, look for technology to help you solve that problem, as opposed to go finding something else that's already a side project. So the right sizing to me is, you focus where you already have people and budget there, and try to improve on that. And that then makes it a lot easier to go and say, I need some money to invest in this, because you already have all your energy and attention there, and you already have the people's time there. Otherwise, you have to divert that time and effort and energy and budget away from what you've been asked to do by your superiors, by your leadership. So I think that's probably the biggest mistake that I've seen. So focus on the things that you're supposed to be focusing on, so you're in line with the strategic goals of the company, and it's also in line with the budget that's already there. And what you'll find is very often is that you can replace things so that you don't need additional budget. Maybe sometimes you need additional budget to get things started, but I've done this as an employee many times. You can oftentimes do something that gets you the return within years, so that you're not really out 1 or 2 fiscal years in terms of getting the money back.
Yeah, no, and I think that's crucial, especially with all these stats that are coming out in the benchmarking of when people are actually realizing it. It's like, we're going to be on to the next thing by the time you guys are monetizing your initial investments. So there's a piggyback question off of what we just asked that came from the audience here. So are you seeing that most companies are having their own AI team, or are the AI projects spread across IT teams?
Yeah, so let me try to break this in. So there are a lot of companies that have their own AI team. When they do, oftentimes if they have been doing this for a while, they came from kind of the data science perspective, not necessarily the Gen AI perspective, right? So these teams are now like, well, do I have now new responsibilities? So they're kind of in between at the moment. The other thing that may happen is if they didn't have an AI team, they're setting it up because now AI is important. Very often we find it becomes it starts with a limited focus. And so that's not a bad thing, but at the same time, the rest of the organization that says, hey, I want me some of that, are kind of stuck because you're saying, okay, well, it's being set up and the first thing they're going to do is X, Y, Z, or, they're still a 6 months or year away, or they're just tackling this problem first and, we got to wait. And so the rest of the business, all these different departments, procurement, finance, HR, you name it, they're all kind of sitting there saying, well, when can I join in? And so what tends to happen is that all these other departments then start to look at it and say, well, how do I do this? And oftentimes the easy answer is, well, I'll just get me a Microsoft Copilot and get started that way, or already have Salesforce and have some AI and turn that on. And so there isn't a lot of support that is out there that is basically a consultant to the business. And so when we work with particularly IT teams, where typically the AI team somewhere sits into, right, the CTO, CIO, type of CDO, right, type of a group, we then go and say, you need to have a consulting arm to the business, and you need to be able to go and communicate with the business and say, okay, because there needs to be an input, right? Because otherwise, what do? You send a ticket to IT and hopefully it works, right? It doesn't really work that way. So that you can start working with procurement, with finance, whatever it is, and say, hey, what do you want to get done? Let me go and figure out what do we already have, and maybe it's plug and play, or maybe it's like a whole custom thing, and guide the business to do that. And this is oftentimes where we partner with existing teams that are there because they just don't have the bandwidth, right? There's just too much to do. They're budgeted for the key focus of AI, but not supporting the rest of the business. And that's really critical because the rest of the business is sitting there going like, well, not only do I want some of this, but I have real challenges I have to meet. And I'm going to get creative in trying to figure those challenges out, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where I feel the shortcoming of some of the AI teams, if they exist at all, are happening within the business.
No, that's awesome. So I hadn't thought about it like that, but what it sounds like you're saying is kind of redirect that AI shouldn't add new strategic initiatives to your methods, right? It should just add new methods to your strategic initiatives. So you just have more tactics to throw at said business challenge. Than you did before. So more arrows in your quiver. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it takes the clunky out of it.
Right. So the one other thing that AI has done, right? I mean, if you come from the IT group, if you're here and you've been in IT, I think for the longest time, people are like, man, I wish business spoke IT, right? I wish business would understand what we could do within IT. Well, it's there. Like business now largely goes and says, oh yeah, I know AI, because we all know AI. It went from like being a automation and business and digital transformation, went from like a largely IT-led function to everybody in the world now knows that AI can help you. Yeah. So you suddenly have an audience in every line of your business that says, hey, I'm interested. And I don't know everything, but I kind of know, what we're talking about. Like I know it can take this messy stuff and they can do it better for me with less resources. Like everybody knows it. Like, so everybody now has an open dialogue to say, I've got ideas, I've got opportunities, I've got a wish list and things like that. So the technology organization, whatever you want to call that group, now needs to rethink how to have the communication with business. Because now suddenly there's many people that want to have a conversation with you. Whereas before you were oftentimes you're going begging. Out hoping, begging for like, hey, you really don't have anything that I can help you with? And business would be like, but how? Like, I don't get it. I don't see it, right? Because it was difficult because we were putting together all these technologies that from a business perspective, you're not living in day to day. You don't really fully, are educated necessarily on like, how can this technology help you? Well, that change management has happened in an instant. And so now everybody gets it. And everybody's like, hey, can I get that? So I think that is a big challenge for organizations as to how do we change the communication layer, forget the consulting layer to advise and optimize and build a program around it, but even just the communication layer with the business so that they know there's somebody there to help them, that they can help figure out how should we, organize ourselves within each of the lines of businesses around it, and how do we build something that really can help involve everybody in the organization.
Yeah, and not just offset another project that's going to be orphaned right down the road too, because I think that's a lot of what the IT, and it's funny because you're right, it's like CTO, CIO, LMNO, it's like all the different ones now, right? There's so many of them, but all of those functions now, especially with cybersecurity being a new focus, data privacy and leakage being, slowly hitting the United States one at a time, in the UK and Europe, obviously always more advanced when it comes to privacy, but as those concerns become top of mind for things that you just need to be able to check a box too, I think it's more and more imperative that we figure out how that dialogue works, and I've been teaching CFOs how to speak IT for the last 10 years. And I think it is a plot twist. I think it's time, for the stakeholders. And the other thing that I'll add, Kelly, to your question is that, we see a lot of folks with committees, right? With AI committees. So they're helping with the decisioning, but that question of who really owns it is at the end of the day, the budget holder. And that still kind of crosses departments and is still a little bit nebulous in some of the early discussions, that folks are having. So I think it's incumbent on groups like this and audiences like this, the evangelizers of the world, to go back to your organizations and say that we finally have a thing that the business users understand in spirit and that IT understands is imperative. Let's do a thing, right? And I think we're finally at a place where we can connect those dots. So Johnny, I did promise everybody some of the use cases. So you always find these like awesome and amazing, so Johnny is a king of like workshopping, doing whiteboard exercises and coming up with really cool ideas. And so I wanted him to share a few of the practical applications of AI that are maybe outside of our normal wheelhouse of use cases, or in it, right? But just to get that, the juices turning, because I think once we all start to understand how practical AI truly can be, it'll begin that conversation that I think all of us are stewards to our organizations for and of, right? So, Johnny, I always love story time with you, but tell me your new ones.
Absolutely. So we were so fortunate that we're able to work with, organizations of all sizes and industries. And so we get into all of these conversations about, hey, can this help? Can this work? Can this be done? Right. And so one of the very simple use cases that's been very interesting is, you probably have heard a lot around, people who want a new job, they'll post their resume and AI is kind of scanning through the resume, right? But what has been interesting, what we've been doing is we've been building solutions to help the actual internal recruiter that goes out and tries to hire somebody, because there's a lot of things that the recruiter can be educated on, and how to speak to somebody, and how do you actually communicate the value of the business and kind of the culture of the business, but also what kind of the job is about, and how their people's lives will change when they come to the organization. It's been interesting to think about, like, how do you almost give a co-pilot to a recruiter? And you'll see this concept of like a co-pilot a number of times, because we're kind of thinking about this in the sense that there's multiple ways that you can have kind of an assistant to you, right? An assistant that has a specific set of skills. This is not a thriller movie, right? But a specific dedicated set of skills that you can then leverage, whether it's in the recruitment side or in the procurement side or in the finance side, so that you can, ask it to do things. And what we find when we start going down, it's a design pattern, right? This assistant type of model, where with recruiting, we can go and say, okay, we know who we're speaking to, and I'm going to have a lot of prepping information ready for me in terms of what do I need to not forget about when we have the conversation. And it gets information together from the actual person that you're trying to entice to come join the company, as well as information about the job, the position, the management team, things like that, stuff that otherwise would take hours to research and put together, that now succinctly you can go in and into a conversation, and you have maybe 10 of these conversations lined up, and you don't have to do that research, right? So that's really powerful. In procurement, we have a similar situation where information that needs to be consumed, whether it is contract data, whether it is vendor information, or whether it is internal project information, to know like what's really a pain point, where are gaps, or are things expiring, or what are some of the snags in terms of being able to manage things. How do we provide a co-pilot to like a procurement resources, right? So we see that co-pilot element come a number of times. There's a number of creative elements that we're seeing, because there is a fundamental change happening, where when you do have a particular function, you can buy SaaS solutions, you can tweak your ERP solutions. But now you can build your own apps, right, with a combination of automation and AI and low code, no code, and things like that. And the value chain has kind of leveled out. So think about this, where if I want to go and say I'm going to subscribe to platform ABC, it's a SaaS solution, going to cost me this much and have this many users. Let's say you pay $500,000 a year for that. It's a lot of money, but I get all the value from it. But then, you go and look at this, and like a year later, you look at this like, hey, I'm paying $500,000 a year, but I'm using 10% of what I really purchased for, right? Well, now the cost for maybe rebuilding that functionality and making it not just be specific to your capabilities, but also remove a lot of the headache of the data entry in and out of those systems and the connectivity of those systems. But automation and AI can help you overcome that. So we see more and more organizations saying, okay, instead of me subscribing to a SaaS solution, let me go maybe build something, right? Let me go build something that I can stitch into my existing platforms that I still need to put the data in and out of, and I can use AI and automation to help me streamline that. So a good use case, there's many use cases around documents and workflow around this, but a good example that we had, there's tons of like Okta and all these type of platforms, but we had a customer that had just massive employee onboarding and retail shops and like all that stuff. And every time they onboard a new employee in like a retail location, there's anywhere between 3 and 20 systems that they have to onboard that employee on. And they had used a bunch of different tools in the past, but still there's a lot of onboarding and onboarding activities that need to happen. So we just automated and built kind of a capability for people to, a mini application for them to manage it all. And so they just set it up like who does what, where, and when. And now it's tied into the HR system. It's tied into the system that they need to interact with. And somebody comes in, all of those things are happening. Onboarding is done. Somebody leaves, all of the unwinding is happening automatically. And they've got basically a central application managing that. That's a really good example of something very simple. So that's a very simple one. A fun one that we looked at that I think would be kind of cool is we talked to somebody who was doing the sound for Broadway. So when you think about all these Broadway shows, you go to look at Annie or whatever, the show of always says Harry Potter. And so they were doing all the sound stages and all of those type of things. And what they're doing is they're doing live transcription of when people are speaking or singing. Right, so you've got a Hamilton, show going on, and as people are speaking, they're transcribing it, and whether they do it as in an app or for people that want to just, read because they're deaf or whatever the thing may be, they're live transcribing it in the air. So we have to figure out how do we use what they already have? How do we do it completely remote because it had to work inside, an actual theater, right, with the sound. The positive and the negatives of that theater sounds, and then how do we bridge the gap in terms of timeline to be able to execute and be able to optimize the transcription, and making sure that it's live in sync with the artist that is basically performing. So those are just some examples, and we can go into dozens and dozens more. But it's fun to see that in all of these different areas, the general theme comes back, which is you need the right data, which means typically connectivity to systems or automation to interact with those systems. And then you need, obviously, the subject matter expertise of what you need to get out of it. And oftentimes it's a combination of not just AI in terms of maybe crunching some data and getting you some output, but maybe also some user experience and how people are going to interact with the data as well. So those are typical components that we see. Happy to go through any other use cases as well.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things you mentioned there too is a lot of those examples for early use cases are using their data, right? So there isn't as much that malaise or fear that comes with open source. Can you speak to how some of these folks might overcome questions about data isn't safe or we're snagging it from other places? So what are some of the things that you do to ease
Absolutely.
Folks' minds on that?
There's a few ways to do this, right? So 100% agree that we want to make sure, first of all and foremost, that we set the stage so that we're in alignment with anything that you have internally as protocols and limitations that the organization has set. But oftentimes we go into an organization and they haven't yet structured that either. So we can go all the way where you can have a completely offline environment where it's not even connected to an outside internet, right? So where all the data resides locally, where all the decision making and activity is happening. We've got customers where we literally have server racks with GPU sitting around doing that. Obviously, that's a little bit of a painful investment, right? So the next best thing is to have a private cloud environment where the data doesn't go anywhere else either. And you can have many options these days where you know that you're maybe interacting with AI, but AI isn't being stored, isn't being used externally, isn't being shared. It's just very controlled, your private instance. And then you can go all the way up to an element where you're just calling something externally and you're feeding it some data. And obviously there you may be cleansing the data before you send it so that there's no risk for data being shared externally, or that you're managing that appropriately. They have multiple layers around the data side, but many use cases are not that complex. Like, I'm saying this, and I'm sure the first one you're going to ask me about is going to be super complex. But oftentimes we get in and people ask us to do things, and we're like, oh, like 60% of it is actually not AI,
Yeah.
right? 60% may be something else that we can connect together, and then maybe there's a component of AI that we can lump in, and now we basically make sure that AI works most optimally. So we can address the concerns. We've done it for Department of Defense all the way to highly regulatory environments in the commercial space. So I know we can address that, but oftentimes it's actually not as big as a problem because many of the data points may never even leave the organization, and can reside either within your own environment or within a private cloud.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of those concerns, again, back to kind of what we recommend you do first is educate yourself, because a lot of these things that are just kind of coming off, in the internet and, oh my God, beware, right? Those are kind of doomsday stories that aren't necessarily applicable or true when you kind of get into it. And you will find that most of the use cases stem from your own organization. So much like, AI kind of iterates within your operations, it also does within your security. So your risk and your governance and your parameters set are still going to be adhered to regardless of the technology that's being applied, right?
Yeah, Paula, one of the very common use cases in general that we work with is anything that's document related, right? When we look at, and document could be, a file, or it could be, a whole drive, or it could be, a whole database of documents, or it could be a whole set of emails, right? Or other type of communication like chat or something like that. So anything that's document related, or anything that's what I would call not as structured from a content perspective, meaning it's not a form and a web page, or a system screen. Now has become a lot easier to process. So you can look at your contracts, your customer email, your whatever order form that you have, your invoices, whatever it may be that you process in documents. And a lot of times what's happening today is that people have to key the data from a document comes into a system. Well, now, AI is a perfect way to intermediary to structure that content, extract that data, and put data into a system for you through automation. So, that's a very common, one. And, any type of document that you have today that you're working with, great way to start, because it's your data, or it's your customer data that you're getting. You're getting the data into your environment, and now you have to extract data from it. So that's a really good one, and it's painful because we don't like documents. At least I don't, extracting data from documents.
Exactly. Especially, yeah. What did that contract say again? What were the terms?
Yeah,
there was a due date somewhere in the invoice schedule. And I think those are the things that that you just don't realize how much you can simplify and how many hours you can reduce in in personal day-to-day activity.
An interesting one. So some of you may have complete solutions for this, but we have many customers where, let's say, if we want to work with the customer, it'll take 3 to 6 months to get on the customer systems and get approval on what's the vendor onboarding and then vendor management. It's a pretty big pain point. And so there's elements around, providing all the documentation, about what are we doing for that customer, for that company, and B, what are our credentials, and how do we ensure that we are a company that's secure and operate around the environment. Well, the content that we provide, oftentimes we have to enter information into your system, but also we have to provide tons of documentation like compliance and insurance and all sorts of other stuff. It's very messy. So the procurement team or the vendor onboarding, vendor management team will spend a lot of time dissecting messy data and then making a decision around who do I need to involve. Like, what groups of IT need to be involved based on the service and based on your credentials and based on the risk and all that stuff, and then what's from the business. And it's kind of an annoying process, right? And then that could be streamlined quite a bit. But then on top of it, now that we're there, every whatever it is, 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is, for all the vendors that you work with, you're recertifying. You're going back around, making sure they still have their certificate, making sure that their data hasn't changed, make sure that the people haven't changed, like all of those things. And again, you go through that entire process. That's a really good example of there's lots of really structured data. There's many systems and there's many people in the organization that need to be involved in this process. And so that whole vendor onboarding, vendor management is a really good example of just streamlining all of that and leveraging automation and AI to simplify a lot of that work that's involved. So it's a really good process that for any of you, I'm sure, would be valuable.
Yeah, no, and definitely seeing the end-to-end process more instead of just these kind of little snacks of tasks to get done, right? Yeah, it's like, let's have the whole meal,
Absolutely, but it's annoying for everybody, right? Like if I'm in IT, it's not my job to do vendor onboarding, but I'm being asked 20 times a month, hey, onboard this vendor, whatever it is, and I could now figure out, okay, what are they doing? So there's a lot for everybody involved. It's not a fun process, but it's a critical one because if you don't check all the boxes, you're not compliant with your customers, with your certificates, with your security and controls, and all these other downstream impacts. So it's a required element. It's not fun, and streamlining it helps everybody. So it's a good one to think about. There's probably many of those processes around where we've got a lot of people involved across many departments that were like, hey, if only this was a little easier for all of us.
Yes. Making anything painless when it comes to multi-document management, I think, is a good start. And procure to pay, I think that's a really good point, because often it starts with invoicing, but that's not the beginning of the process, right? The invoicing should carry through some of the tasks and updates that were done when you vendor onboarded to begin with, right? In preparation for the invoices. So it really gives us an opportunity to see things end to end, much more seamlessly.